Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight as we continue our journey through Second Corinthians. We have been looking at Paul's relationship with the Corinthians, and this letter is a little bit different than what we come across in First Corinthians, as Paul is dealing with various issues. And in Second Corinthians, he's really dealing with his relationship with the Corinthian brethren. There's the faction there in Corinth that's maybe causing some trouble between the Christians and Paul, and he's concerned about this relationship because of what it means to their acceptance of his message, which in Paul's mind is always of most importance. It's the message above the messenger. And as we've been going through this, as we have every week, Ken Chapman is with us in Orlando. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing good. Just enjoying the heat and humidity. And here in Central Florida, we're getting ready for Elsa, tropical storm / hurricane that's headed this way. Maybe headed your way as well, Jonathan.
Yeah,
so
we'll see which way the wind blows on that one. We've actually had a very mild summer so far. I'm not going to complain about that at all. The kids are at camp, and it's much cooler than it was the last time they went to camp. So they're happy about that. Well, the temperature, to be corny, but with a good segue, the temperature turns down in our section tonight as we move to 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9. It's a text that I think we are much more familiar with than some of the rest of 2 Corinthians because of its use in giving and contribution talks that we may have at church on Sundays. We regularly read these passages, think about these passages. If the preacher is going to preach on giving, he has to use these passages. There's only a few he can use, and this is going to be one of them. But because this is such a long section, tonight we're going to do it a little bit differently. We are going to cover 8 and 9 together, but we're not going to read through the whole section. That would take the majority of our time. We're just going to kind of outline the section and note Paul's main points and how he encourages them to participate in this endeavor. But before we dig into 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, why don't we look backwards to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verses 1 and 4, where Paul initially brings this discussion up to the Corinthians and advises them to prepare for this gift that is going to be going to Jerusalem. So Ken, if you don't mind, why don't you read this section for us, and then we can see how it's going to relate to 2 Corinthians.
Again, 1 Corinthians 16, verses 1 through 4. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I directed to the churches of Galatia, so you also are to do. On the first day of every week, each of you is to put something aside and store it up as he may prosper, so that there will be no collecting when I come. And when I arrive, I will send those whom you accredit by letter to carry your gift to Jerusalem. If it seems advisable that I should go also, they will accompany me.
So it doesn't seem that this is the first mention of this to the Corinthians. Would you agree with that, Ken? That phrase, now concerning the collection of things, almost sounds like maybe they've asked a question or it's something that's been mentioned before, and he's just giving them advice on how to handle the actual process of collecting the money.
Yeah, it seems in that statement, without any clarification or further discussion, that Paul is assuming that they are aware of it, whether they had heard that directly from Paul or had heard it through the grapevine, so to speak. It doesn't seem apparent that they were aware of this being done by others. And maybe this may be the first time Paul is putting the responsibility on them, right, but they do seem to be aware that this is taking place.
Right. And then so we make this connection between here and 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, and we don't want to think that some great length of time has gone by here. Paul, these letters from Paul seem to be pretty boom, boom. That's the technical term for that, Ken. Boom, boom. And, Paul is really dealing with these pressing issues. And so he can respond in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 with just a little bit more reminder about the situation And it's not like he's rebuking them because this great length of time has gone by and they haven't done anything. These letters are fairly close together. And so he's just, again, reminding them a little bit closer to time that he's going to be heading towards Jerusalem. So the time is upon us. We need to get moving.
Yeah, some scholars think about a year transpired between First and Second Corinthians, and a year may seem like a long time to us in between communications, but you need to remember that in their mode of travel and communication and what was going on, sending Titus there, some would argue, as we've talked about before, other visits, other letters maybe in that interim. But if you take my view that what we have is all there was, even the fact of Titus visit and in between that, and again, the modes of travel and communication, a year is, like you said, it technically boom, boom.
I believe that's going to come back up at some point. So then we turn our attention to 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, passages that we are very familiar with here. And maybe we can start with this one phrase before we really dig in, Ken. We want you to know, brethren, about the grace of God that has been given among the churches of Macedonia. The term grace, we maybe often immediately go to the idea of salvation and the forgiveness of sins, but Paul uses that idea in a number of different ways. He does use it of salvation and the forgiveness of sins, but he also uses it of his ministry, of preaching the gospel. And here it seems that it's a reference to this gift that is being collected to be sent to Jerusalem. Would you agree with that use of the word grace there?
Yeah, it's just general meaning, and we use this sometime when we define the term grace. Is just the gift, whether it was the gift of Paul's ministry or here the gift of God, of the generosity of these Christians. So yeah, I would agree with that.
So in verses 1 through 5, we have Paul giving to the Corinthians the example of the Macedonian churches. And what Paul does here is pretty sly. And he's using what the Macedonians have done to kind of push or pressure the Corinthians into matching such efforts. And as we think about the Macedonian churches, we're at least thinking of what Philippi, Thessalonica, maybe the Berean brethren up north of Corinth, and what we can typically think of as Greece. And so these congregations have done so much that they, even in the midst of all their affliction, he says they're just pouring out more than they really even have. And then maybe the key line here is in verse 5, and this not as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord and then by the will of God to us. And their hearts are in the right place. And that's what makes the generosity possible, is because their hearts are where they need to be. And so Paul is kind of using them to push or pressure or encourage the Corinthians to do the same kind of things. My son loves baseball. And so when somebody else does something good, I can say, oh, well, look at how he did that. You know, he was really aggressive. He really hustled. And then, you know, my son is supposed to pick up on the idea, okay, hustle, 24, run out the ground balls to first base, you know, never let up. You know, he kind of picks up on the implication that's been given there.
You know, Paul does a little bit of that in that text we just read in 1 Corinthians 16, and talking about, as I gave direction to the churches of Galatia.
All right. Yes.
And so you're not the only one in this. We're all in this together. And I've told them, and now I'm telling you. And now he brags on the Macedonians as well. So
in verses 6 through 11, you could kind of just summarize this by saying, let's finish what we started. You know, we find out about this in 1 Corinthians, and it seems that they probably began to do some of this, but time is upon us. We need to finish this up, get everything together here. Titus is there. We've urged him to be instrumental in what's going on here, and he's going to do that. And then in verse 8, he says, I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine. And so basically finish what you have started in verse 11. So now finish doing it as well, so that your readiness in desiring it may be matched by your completing it out of what you have. I think that's a really important point there. And we can see this in our own lives, even about secular things, that sometimes we might have a desire, but we don't ever do anything about it. We might desire to write a book, but we never put forth the effort to get it done. And Paul is saying, I know you have the desire, but let's make sure we put in the effort to finish it up here. So again, just admonishing them, encouraging them that the time has come. We need to get this together here.
You know, one thing I find interesting in this little section is verse 7. To think that verse 7 and the commendation there was addressed to the church at Corinth is somewhat staggering.
Yes.
He says, you excel in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge and all earnestness and in our love for you. Paul is boasting on there. You're doing good in other areas, do good in this area. But I don't think any of us would say that we're doing good in that other area after reading First Corinthians, but Paul does. And so it gives us a little bit different view maybe of the church at Corinth than we traditionally have had.
Although you look at that last phrase in verse 7, in our love for you. But however, some manuscripts say in your love for us. And it's almost like, well, wait a minute, they can't excel in Paul's love for them. That's up to Paul. But I think that's kind of interesting, maybe a little jab also there. But I agree with your point here. I think that's pretty good. In verses 12 through 15, the summary here seems to be saying, right now, you brethren have plenty, and you can share with those who don't have anything. And there may come a time when those who now don't have anything will have something and you don't, and they'll share with you. And I think what you see here is maybe on a macro scale, what you see in the very first part of the book of Acts is when all these new Christians are here together, and especially those local who have extra, who have land, sell these things and share with maybe those who aren't local, who wound up staying in Jerusalem longer than they had intended to possibly. But everybody who had something shared with those who didn't. And Paul says, this is what we're doing now, and this is important to do. And there may come a time of reciprocity when they pay these back. I'm not saying that you're going to be burdened while they're not. That's not the idea. But it's helping those who need help at this time. Ken, you looked like you had something there.
Well, you know, exactly. There may be this kind of in-kind exchange, but it also makes me think of the text in Romans chapter 15. We're talking about the same subject, the collection for the saints. He talks about how that you, Gentiles, have benefited spiritually. You know, the saints in Jerusalem are the ones who sent me and Barnabas off, you know, on these journeys, and sent others there spiritually. And it's from them the gospel has poured forth. And so they've done their part spiritually. Now you need to do your part in reciprocity financially. And so it could be, yes, that they'll have an abundance financially, but it may be that they'll be able to help you spiritually in some way as well.
And kind of piggybacking on that, the idea of the coming together of the Jews and Gentiles here. This is going to be a majority Gentile gift being given to a majority Jewish group. And so the unity that Paul is hoping to accomplish through some of this is extremely important as well. Then we come to verses 16 through 24 as Paul begins to discuss maybe some of the more technical aspects of how this is going to work, how we're going to get this to Jerusalem. Titus is going to have a part in this. So we have this commendation of Titus. We also have an interesting passage in verse 18 when he says, with him we are sending the brother who is famous among all the churches for his preaching of the gospel. And Ken, is it possible that Paul is talking about D. Bowman here? D's not quite that old. It's such an interesting phrase here. We don't see this kind of a thing a lot, especially as Paul writes to the Corinthians. Paul has written to the Corinthians downplaying speaking ability, rhetorical ability. And now he mentions this brother who is famous for his preaching, but notice he doesn't give the guy's name. And so maybe that's how he balances that. Now, I would imagine the Corinthians know who he's talking about. As I read this, Ken, I can't help but think maybe we're talking about Apollos. Obviously, we don't know. He doesn't say. But Apollos is initially mentioned in the book of Acts as being a good speaker and preacher. He does have a connection with the church in Corinth. And then so I guess my question to you is there anybody else he could be talking about? And why not just go ahead and mention the name of this individual?
I think there's three choices. One is Apollos, as you said, that he would fit the idea of being famous among the Corinthians, at least, and as you said, for his eloquent ability. The second option that some offer is maybe it's Luke, the frequent traveling companion of Paul. And the ones who lean toward Luke focus on the idea of the preaching of the gospel. That Luke, the author of one of the gospels, and so he's known for that, and so that's a possibility. The third option is that it's somebody else, and so unknown to us. Obviously, we don't know who it is, but the idea of him not mentioning him by name, particularly if it's Apollos that he's talking about, may play into the early discussions in 1 Corinthians, where you remember the Corinthians were, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, and Paul downplayed their roles as preachers of the gospel, saying that they're jars of clay, we've looked at here, and so he may be doing that as well, not wanting to feed into that frenzy of, if I mention Apollos' name, then they're going to be, I'm of Apollos. And so he may be kind of downplaying, as he did his and Apollos' role in both 1st and 2nd Corinthians.
Right. So whoever this is going to join in with Titus and Paul as they are going to carry this gift to Jerusalem. And I think Paul is just practically wise in what's happening here. He gets these congregations to suggest who might carry this gift with him, as they're going to be taking this large sum of money, it seems, to Jerusalem. He wants everything on the up and up. He wants everything to be very see-through, very transparent. Who's getting what, who's giving what, that Paul's not going to run off with this money, that Titus is not going to run off with this money, that this famous preacher is not going to run off with this money. Maybe preachers are well known to do that. So he just wants everything to be on the up and up, everything to be kind of on the honor system here. We are going to be truthful in how we did this, how we handled this, which is extremely important. Not to mention, you might want a little bit of a good sized group carrying this simply for protection as they travel at this point in time with a large sum of money. That could have been an issue as well. And so he just kind of lets them know what's going on, how we're going to get this to Jerusalem as we think about the carriers of this gift. And, we put in chapter 9 here, just simply probably for convenience sake, the chapter break here, but he's continuing the discussion. And I like what Paul does here. He's going to add a little bit more pressure here. He goes, I've been boasting to everybody about you and telling them how good you're doing and how much you want to help in this endeavor. Don't make me look bad. So really puts the pressure on them. parents do this to children as they get, well, Ken, I did it yesterday. We were going to a funeral, the visitation for a funeral, and we lined the kids up. We're ready to go in. All right, now you listen to me. You don't make any noise. You don't fight with each other. Keep your hands to yourselves. Don't embarrass me. And so a little bit, Paul's kind of doing this, but he frames it much more positively. I've been boasting about you. Don't let me down. And so he adds some of this pressure to him in verses 1-5. We see this going on here. But notice in verse 2, and your zeal has stirred up most of them. And so what Paul has been doing is using the Corinthians to encourage others, just like he used the Macedonians and the Galatians to encourage them. And that had to be important to the Corinthians, because boy, it seems like they've been taking their licks from Paul lately. And he says, no, I've been using you to encourage others as well.
One thing that's kind of funny until you understand it in its context, at least twice already, Paul has told them, now you don't have to do this. If the last verse here, verse 5, so that the gift that may be ready as a willing gift, not as an exact. In other words, this isn't something you have to do, but Paul is sure putting the pressure on them to do it. It's like, wait a minute, you're saying I don't have to, but it sounds like we kind of do. But I think we need to remember that all that Paul is doing is pressuring them to fulfill their obligation that they'd already made, the commitment they'd already made. Right. He's not trying to guilt them into doing something they don't really want to do. They'd already said, we'll do this.
Yes.
And so Paul is putting pressure on them, but it's just pressure to keep their word and their commitment.
Yeah, back in chapter 8, finish what you started. This is something you wanted to do. You had the willingness. Paul's pressure, Paul's encouragement is coming in the completion of that. Don't leave this half done, is basically what he says. And then maybe I don't know if I should say this, maybe the most well-known section of chapter 9 here is what comes in verses 6-15, especially verse 6. The point is this: whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows bountifully will also reap bountifully. Each one must give as he has decided in his heart, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And I'm not ridiculing, I'm not complaining, but how many times have we heard this before the collection, before the contribution? But that doesn't make it any less true. How many times have we heard the gospel and it's not any less true? This is true. God does love a cheerful giver, and the admonition here is to make sure our hearts are right, just like the Macedonians. The Macedonians' hearts were in the right place. They had given their hearts to God, and so they were cheerful. They weren't having to do this out of expectation or under compulsion here. And so he's just wanting them to understand the same idea. And really, this is to your benefit. The one who sows sparingly will reap sparingly. The one who sows bountifully will reap bountifully. And he actually continues in here about their righteousness in taking part of this. This is for their benefit. They will grow in this activity. Tangentially related to that, Ken, I've sometimes made the point that those who are sick in the congregation, they'll often say, we'll offer to bring them dinner or something. And no, we'll make it. I've encouraged them to accept that, to let their brothers and sisters help them, to help them bear their burden, because it's good for them. And so we need to be participating in these kind of things because it's good for us. It benefits us. But Paul doesn't stop there. It's not only good for us, but it also ends up with God's glory. And he talks about when this is ultimately delivered, how much thanksgiving is going to be made to God. How these Jerusalem brethren are going to hit their knees and pray to God and thank God for this, and thank God for the Macedonian brethren and the Galatian brethren and the Corinthian brethren, and the love that has been outpoured for them. And at the end of the day, God will be glorified by what is happening here. And so Paul concludes this. Well, I always feel weird patting the Holy Spirit on the back. But Paul concludes this very powerfully. He begins with a human example, but then ends with the glory of God. And maybe that's a good way to move through this idea here, is that everything should end with the glory of God. Ken, any thoughts on this last section here?
Two thoughts. He kind of ends this section the way he started it. Thanks be to God for his inexpressible gift. And remember, we started this discussion in chapter 8, verse 1, talking about the grace of God.
Right.
And so in all of this, is you're right, it's God's getting the glory. And he says this is God's gift. What God's people are doing is God's grace and God's gift to these people. And so it does bring glory to him in that way. But I think it bears mentioning before we move on who this collection is for. You know, we could talk about the circumstances of history that made the need so great there in Jerusalem and Judea. But here, multiple times in 1 Corinthians 16, in Romans 15, throughout the book of Acts, when this collection from the various churches is being talked about, it's always mentioned as a collection for the saints. Right. And so we could spend a whole discussion talking about the idea of what we sometimes call limited benevolence. The church is not in the business of helping the entire world in some kind of benevolent sense. We're just not set up for that. That's not our purpose. And so notice the phrasing, Romans 15, 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 here, over and over again, that this was a collection for the needy saints. And that's our obligation that we need to fulfill.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you said you wanted to make a couple of comments before we move on. Well, we're moved out. That's it on the text here. Again, I think you can probably see why we wanted to cover these two chapters together and why we covered them in this manner. And you can just see how Paul progresses through his thought, through his encouragement of these Corinthian brethren. And it's almost a little bit of a reprieve from what we've had so far in this letter, is Paul is having some stern things to say, and almost a little bit of a break, but it's fixing to ramp back up here in chapters 10 through 13. And we will begin that next week. We will look at chapter 10, verses 1 through 6. Ken will lead us through that discussion. And until then, we appreciate you being with us and listening and studying the Word of God with us. God bless, and we'll see you next time.